If you enjoy a good art book, be sure to check out She's a Wildcat, The Art of Candy. I co-created the book with Candy, who is one of the most talented lowbrow artists of all time, so I had such a blast working on it and hope you will reading it. For more information about the book and where you can get a copy, just follow the link in the description. This is a review of The Art of Mr. Peabody and Sherman. A while back we had a look through The Art of the Incredibles, and what I loved about that book was the mid-century modern influence, and so I wanted to find something that kind of continued to explore that aesthetic, and this book certainly has a good dose of that. Not to the same extent as The Incredibles, but that's not surprising as it's not really a distinguishing feature of the art direction of Mr. Peabody and Sherman like it was in The Incredibles, which is stylistically a much stronger, more defined movie. But at any rate, there's still plenty of stuff in this book, from the graphic design elements throughout to most of the concept art itself seems pretty inspired by the mid-century modern UPA animation style. And of course it's not an exact recapturing of that, it's just more of a subtle influence, more that the art direction is inspired by it, but adapted in a way that's more in keeping with contemporary 3D animation. A good visual indicator of that is, I don't know if you noticed when I showed the front and back of the dust jacket, but it has the characters in the original J. Ward style that are marching through the Wayback Door and come out the other side in this movie's style. The book's published by Insight Editions, so it's no surprise that the book design is pretty fantastic. They do such a great job designing their books. I mentioned a second ago how the graphic design has a retro vibe that fits really well with the movie's art direction, and even just something like the French folds on the dust jacket that help make it more durable against tearing. Even though you buy these books for the art, the attention to good book design just contributes to a much more pleasing experience overall. Although technically the one I've got here is actually published by Titan. Titan does the UK publishing and distribution of many of Insight Editions books, so except for their logo, it's exactly the same book, no differences. They didn't even change the spelling of words like color. But anyway, I just can't stress how great I think the art in this book is. The style and look of it I just find so appealing. It's retro, it's modern, it's minimalist, but without feeling cheap. It's very classy and yet very warm. Almost all of the art in here feels like it truly does deserve to be showcased in an art book, which, given the nature and function of concept art, is not always the case with what you see in many movie art books. And so the curation here is excellent. I think it's also really helped by the fact that the movie's story involves time travel, which lends itself to making for a visually diverse and engaging art book. We go from the modern world to revolutionary France, ancient Egypt, Renaissance Italy, Troy. This variety means you never have a chance to get bored or feel anything is too samey. I often find it to be the case that movies that take place in multiple worlds tend to spawn pretty great art books, things like Wreck-It Ralph, Ready Player One, or even Sucker Punch. So by far the best thing about this book and its curation is that the majority of what you see is different to how it appears in the movie. Sometimes that's just small little details, and other times it's big stuff that's completely different or entirely absent from the final film. I wouldn't say there's much in terms of step-by-step evolution of the designs, but there is a lot in terms of exploration, which I think is the most enjoyable and valuable stuff to see in an art book. It feels like most of what's being shown is less of the literal final designs like you see in most other art books, and instead it's more like the art that inspired what you see on screen, which is what I think an art book should be and what makes this one so successful, in addition to the fact that the art itself is really great, of course. However, there are two disappointments with this book. The first is that the text is almost completely worthless. Whether it's the author or quotes from the crew, it's just all shallow, banal, and frivolous. There is very little insightful information in here as to the art and making of this movie, or even just Easter eggs and trivia. The worst part is that at the end there's a chapter called Building a Scene, which takes a specific scene and attempts to break down the factors required in bringing it to life, which might sound great, but it's not even Animation 101, it's Animation 1901, for people who have never encountered the animation process before, even on the most basic level. And even if somehow you're oblivious to that knowledge, it's still so shallow and obvious that you should already understand it just by the virtue of having a brain and common sense. What makes this chapter twice as bad is that it's presented as a dialogue between Peabody and Sherman, and just like every other book or DVD that's tried to use the fictional characters to explain the non-fictional fiction making of the movie, it's terrible and doesn't work. It's trying to blend entertainment with education in a way that just doesn't satisfy either. I know it's just meant to be cute or fun or whatever, but the reality is it is just stupid, cringy, and clunky, especially when you could have had the filmmakers communicating this stuff like normal. And you may say, well, this is a children's movie, so maybe that's who all this is aimed at. Well, that doesn't fly, I'm afraid, as all film art books, including this one, are otherwise very clearly aimed at an adult audience. I mean, potentially this chapter could have been a good idea if it had been much more focused on this film or scene specifically, with information that was actually interesting, and cut out the nonsense and generalized information. I mean, imagine if every art book took up 10 pages just to describe the basics of how a scene is created in animation, and it's especially awful for this book in particular as it does not have those pages to waste, which leads me to my second disappointment with the book, and that is it doesn't feel like there's as much stuff in here as there should be. I made a similar comment in The Art of the Incredibles, but it's different because a lot of that was due to poor layout, leaving things feeling quite sparse, whereas this book has excellent layout, a few too many full-page images, but most were appropriate and probably not what's responsible for this dissatisfaction. Instead, it's that the book feels too short. And I don't mean that in the sense of, you know, when you like a book and you always want there to be more. I mean that this book legitimately feels like it needs another 20 to 30 pages. It's about 155 pages, which is already less than the average art book, so everything rushes by and it's over so quickly. Scenes like Egypt and Troy only have maybe a dozen artworks each. And while sometimes I do feel unreasonable about demanding more art from a book, because for all we know, maybe this genuinely is all the best work produced, except in this case, I know for a fact it's not. I was looking online and there are tons of equally amazing pieces of concept art that aren't included in here, and that seems pretty inexcusable to me considering how easy it would have been to include more stuff just by cutting out that building a scene chapter, or reducing the number of unnecessary full-page images, or even just adding more pages to a book that really could use it would have been such a great improvement. And to miss out on so many beautiful and interesting pieces is a real disappointment. It's interesting just to compare this to the Incredibles art book, since I've already mentioned it twice and still have it on the brain. I highly doubt there is anyone who likes this movie better than the Incredibles, yet I always find the art books for DreamWorks movies to be much better than the Pixar ones, and in this case that's really saying something, because I think The Art of the Incredibles is one of the best Pixar art books, as well as being my favourite Pixar movie, while on the other hand this Mr. Peabody and Sherman book is one of the weaker, or maybe that's not fair, so we'll say simpler DreamWorks art books, and on a movie I wouldn't go so far as to call myself a fan of, and yet, of the two, this one is definitely the superior art book. And I think that's really cool, because it proves that even if you aren't a fan of a particular movie, its art book can independently stand on its own feet and be well worth your consideration if the art appeals to you. And of course, if you are a fan of the movie, then that's just icing on the cake. Speaking of which, if you are a big fan of the original Mr. Peabody and Sherman, or that style of animation, you might want to check out The Art of J. Ward Productions. Or for more mid-century animation goodness in general that's actually from that period, there's a book called Cartoon Modern, and another one called They Drew as They Pleased, Volume 4, The Hidden Art of Disney's Mid-Century Era. The Disney one is pretty good, but I can't say the same for the J. Ward book nor Cartoon Modern, but because there are so few books on these subjects, you may still want to look into those.